So tonight I'd like to explore a little bit the whole role, very controversial role, behind Pope Pius XII during the Second World War, and namely during the Holocaust. As many of you know, when people bring up the name of Pius XII, often a common response will be, wasn't that guy Hitler's pope? Now, if you'd made that accusation before the year 1967, no one would have ever believed you. Because right after the World War was over and the world was beginning to understand the extent of the Holocaust, the one person who was being praised continually for his efforts during the war was Pope Pius XII. So what happened between the end of the war and here we are standing today? Well, in the year 1999, a gentleman by the name of John Cornwell wrote a book called Hitler's Pope. And I'm not here tonight to cast judgment on Mr. Cornwell, who he is, but maybe a little bit of background to understand where he was coming through in this book. Mr. Cornwell is an ex-seminarian who was studying to be a priest and never did. And he spent a lot of his career as a journalist writing books that have been very, very critical of the church, especially what he deems to be very conservative traditional elements within the church. The biggest problem with his book is he's a journalist, and he's not a very good historian. And what's happened is, as people have read his book, they've realized it's full with many glaring errors. Perhaps the most notable one is he claimed that he spent a lot of time in the Vatican archives going through files during the time of Pius XII, and he gives you the impression that he spent weeks, even months, in this study. But whenever you check into the archives, you got to sign in. And the records show he only signed in once, for an afternoon. Now, if I wrote a history paper in an afternoon and tried to pawn it off as a book with a lot of research, I don't think it would go very far. But nonetheless, the book was extremely popular, even though historians really tore it apart. And I like what one Newsweek columnist had to say about the book. He said, "It's a classic example when an ill-equipped journalist assumes the sober airs of scholarship based on second-hand sources and books that are already criticizing the late Pius XII. He's actually been honest enough to admit that in the past 10 years, there's been a whole lot more research done into the subject, and he needs to revise a lot of what he said in the book, but he's yet to have the decency to have the book pulled. And so it's still a top seller, as I checked on Amazon the last day. So is any of it true? Was he a hero? Was he a villain? Who was Pius XII, and specifically, what did he have to do, and what did he care about the Jewish people during the Holocaust? Was he a collaborator with Hitler? Was he an anti-Semite? Or was he just too silent, too cowardly, didn't do enough to help people in their time of great need? And I think before we look at Pius's role, it's good for us to step back for one moment and to look briefly at the history between the Jewish people and the papacy. Because we know one of the great stigmas of us as being Christians is we haven't always treated the Jewish people particularly well, and sometimes we've treated them horribly, even put them to death. And so that is something we carry with us as a Christian people. And when you look at the role of the papacy, again, you had those who were kind to the Jews, those who were always not. But what is noticeable throughout history is that they were probably the single most consistent defender of Jewish rights over the last 2,000 years. And I can't give you the examples of every pope, but I'd like to speak about some of the highlights, some of the different things that popes did to protect Jewish rights during the history of Europe. We can start with Great Gregory the Great. Back in the 500s, he said that they should never have infringements upon their rights, and we should not vilify them. They are to live as Romans, and they are to have full authority over their possessions, and we are not to disturb their Sabbath observances. He even chastised one of his local bishops in Italy for confiscating a synagogue and probably gave it back to the Jewish people. In the 12th century, Pope Calixtus II, this is during the time of the Crusades, sent out a decree all across Europe saying, "Leave the Jewish ghettos alone." What would happen is the Crusaders would pass through towns and they would often attack the ghetto in order to take their money. He explicitly forbade them from doing so, even though the Crusaders often ignored him. Pope Innocent IV came to the defense of the Jews of Europe when something was going around called the blood libel. And the blood libel was this myth that the Jewish people went out, stole Christian children, killed them, took their blood, and made Passover bread. This pope came out very explicitly saying, this is wrong, stop accusing the Jewish people of doing this. Pope Clement VI in the 1300s came to their defense when they were being accused of spreading the Black Plague through Europe. Pope Boniface IX in 1402 made the Jews citizens of the city of Rome. That was very rare that Jews could ever be citizens of a European city. Pope Martin V protected them against forced baptisms. He also protected them in expanding their civil rights, especially in Rome. He forbade the Franciscans from preaching hatred against them for whatever reason. They were doing a lot of that at that time, and he even took a Jewish doctor as his own physician. Pope Sixtus IV in the Renaissance time brought in many Jewish scholars into the Vatican, and he asked them to make Hebrew manuscripts for the archives. And even the notorious Alexander VI from the Borgia family with all his illegitimate children was actually a great defender of the Jewish people, very close to the Rabbi of Rome. He created the first chair of Hebrew studies at the University of Rome, and he welcomed in a lot of Jews who were fleeing the Spanish Inquisition after they had been kicked out of the country. And there, all of a sudden, a tremendous amount of Spanish Jews began to live in the city of Rome. During the Reformation, Pope Leo X and the Medici family were very close to the Jews, great friends of them. At that time, the Jewish people had to wear a badge to identify themselves that they were Jews, and Pope Leo told them to remove that. Into the 1700s, Pope Benedict XIV especially helped out the Jews in Poland because there were frequently attacks against them. And Pius X, St. Pius X, also did similar. He rebuked the bishops in Poland for anti-Semitic behavior. And then Pope Pius XI, who came just before Pius XII, was a tremendous defender of the Jewish people. He was very close friends with the Rabbi of Rome, the leaders of the Jewish Roman community. He wrote a very strong condemnation against anti-Semitism in 1928. And very famously, as the Nazis rose to power, he said on one occasion, spiritually, we're all Semites. You can imagine what the Nazis had to say about that. But what about Pius XII? Who was Pius XII? We've seen that the history of the papacy has been a lot of defenders of the Jews. What about him personally? Well, Pius XII, when he was born Eugenio Pacelli, and he was born in the city of Rome. And it had been a very, very, very long time before that a Roman would actually become the Pope. And Pacelli was part of a noble family, and they made up something that was called the Black Nobility. And the Black Nobility were royalty within the country, mostly in Rome, and they were great defenders of the papacy, especially against the Italian government that was trying to infringe upon the church's rights. And so Pacelli's whole life revolved around Rome, and he really grew up in its church. So it's not surprising that he became a priest and that he quickly entered the diplomatic corps, and he became the nuncio. A papal nuncio is the Pope's official representative in a country, and he went to Germany in the 1920s, which was not a very good time to be in Germany. It was during the great economic upheaval, and Cardinal Pacelli was known for his charitable works, especially among the German people. He later became the Secretary of State, so basically the number 2 guy in the Vatican, in 1939. And as a child, it's said that he actually had a lot of Jewish friends. He once attended the Passover supper, and one of his Jewish friends, Guido Mendes, tells that as he was studying to be a priest, he was frequently asking for Hebrew books and Jewish philosophy and theology to better understand them. And then when he entered the diplomatic corps in 1916, he helped Pope Benedict XV draft an encyclical that spoke out against anti-Semitism in Poland. He was also the friend of many German Jews, example, the composer Bruno Walter, and he helped one of his friends to escape Bavaria in those times. We also know that when Cardinal Pacelli went on a tour of America, he met one Charles Father Coughlin, and Father Coughlin had a very popular radio show, very anti-Semitic, and Cardinal Pacelli shut him down, and he wasn't able to preach anymore. And throughout his time as a nuncio, there was 40 declarations that he made where he denounced anti-Semitic behavior. Where things get really heated for him, though, is in 1939. And this is the year that, as Secretary of State, he goes to Germany and he signs the concordat with the Nazis. He never actually met Hitler during the negotiations, but he signed this treaty. And we need to appreciate that during this time, the way the Vatican had diplomatic relations with different countries were things called concordats. They were not treaties that they would say basically saying, yes, we acknowledge everything your state is doing. No. It was a way to have diplomatic relations between the countries because there was a lot of countries in Europe that were very anti-Catholic and very anti-Vatican. And so they needed some way to protect the church's rights in those countries. So when they signed the concordat with the Nazis, some of the things the church gained was the ability to continue church services, be able to have contact with its clergy and its laity, and very importantly, they had the permission to publicly speak on matters of dogma and morality. And this would be very convenient because now the church had a legal stance to speak out against such moral problems as racism, which is at the core of Nazi ideology. And they would use this very, very effectively when they would speak out publicly in the German church. So the concordat was a very important piece of diplomacy between the Vatican and the Nazi state. Even though they signed this concordat, right afterwards, Cardinal Pacelli went to the nuncio in Germany and said this. He says, "The Holy Father, Pius XI, asks you to become actively involved in helping the Jews of Germany, as this is a request of their rabbis." When the Nazis found out about this, they were quite furious, and this is what they had to say about Cardinal Pacelli. They said, "He's not accepted with favor in Germany because he opposes Nazism, and he is practically determined by the pro-Jewish policies of the Vatican under the present Pope." But Pacelli was even harsher than that. In 1935, when he met with the Bishop of Cologne, he said of the Nazis, he says, "They are false prophets with the pride of Lucifer." He told the great theologian Dietrich von Hildebrand that there is no possible reconciliation between Christianity and Nazism. They are like fire and water. And when he went to Lourdes to speak to the pilgrims there, he said, the Nazis are possessed by a superstition of race and a purity of blood. He even gave documents to Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father, to be sent to America, where he spoke out very strongly against the Nazi regime. Probably his most important task as Secretary of State is he helped Pius XI create an encyclical in 1937. You'll have to excuse my lack of German, but it's called Mit brennender Sorge, which I believe translates to "with burning anxiety." And in this encyclical, it was interesting because it was never published in Latin, never published in Italian, but only published in German. And in it, it speaks and condemns neo-paganism, it condemns racism, it condemns the rejection of the Old Testament. It was a veiled attack against the Nazis. It doesn't specifically say them by name, but it especially attacks the idea of racism, superior races, purity of blood. And what they did with the encyclical was it was sent to Germany, and it was ordered that every priest was to read it on Palm Sunday. And the backlash against the church was severe. When the Nazis found out that this thing was being read, persecutions against the church broke out. Persecutions intensified, sadly, against the Jews. So far as for the Nazis to begin to say, well, actually, Pius XI is half Jew, and that's why he's protecting them. And Hitler then went out of his way to send out the Hitler Youth to collect every copy of the encyclical possible. And if you were caught with the possession of it on your person, you could be sent to a concentration camp. So the Nazis took this encyclical very, very seriously and saw it as a great attack against them, why they were so unfavorable towards Pope Pius XI and Cardinal Pacelli at that time. And as Pius XI's papacy was coming to an end, he became more and more vocal against what was happening in Europe. When he found out the Cardinal Archbishop of Vienna was flying the swastika above the cathedral, he lashed out against him. And when Hitler rode into Rome in 1938, the whole city exploded in excitement to greet him. But there were two notable people not in the Rome that day, Pius XI and Cardinal Pacelli. They got in their car and drove out to Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer residence. And to make their point even clearer, they turned off all the lights in the Vatican so that when Hitler showed up, there was not a soul to greet him. It was a very bold statement that the church was saying is they were not going to deal with this dictator. Towards the very end of his life, there is a rumor, it hasn't been confirmed or not, but there was a rumor that Pius XI was drafting another encyclical, very specifically against anti-Semitism. The encyclical never saw the light of day, and there's still debate whether it was people have just said he was going to do it, or actually if this document exists in the Vatican archives to this day. But nonetheless, when he died, the Jews of Rome mourned him very deeply, and the chief rabbi and many of its leaders were present at his funeral mass, and they said this of him. They said, "He denounced with luminous firmness and clarity the pernicious error of racist paganism and condemned anti-Semitism as irreconcilable with the Christian faith." Much to many people's surprise, Cardinal Pacelli became the next pope. He wasn't expected to become the pope, actually, and he took, in honor of his predecessor and close friend, the name of Pius XII. And at his coronation as Roman pontiff, the chief rabbi of Rome was present, leaders of the Jewish Roman community were present. Interesting, there was one country who didn't send a representative, Nazi Germany. When Joseph Goebbels, he was the great propaganda master of the Nazi party, he says that in Hitler's diary it said that he was considering even ending the concordat with the Vatican over Pacelli's rise to the papacy because he knew how pro-Jewish he was, and as history will show, he was absolutely right. And he acted very quickly in coming to the Jews' defense. In 1939, in Italy, Benito Mussolini had forbidden any Jew from teaching in a university or a government position, so Pius XII very kindly employed them at the Vatican, in the archives, in the libraries, and in the Pontifical Academy of the Sciences. He also did something very important, and this is where the concordat with Germany would become very helpful. He sent out decrees to all the nuncios across Europe saying, give any Jewish person who asks for it a fake baptism certificate, because that could be their pass in order to escape a concentration camp and could help them to immigrate out of the country or move to another country where the persecutions were not so bad. And tens of thousands, if not more, were produced for any Jewish person who came forward asking for them. When he offered his first encyclical, called Summi Pontificatus, he spoke out very explicitly against the persecution of the Jews. And because he did so, the Allies took this encyclical and then dropped it into Germany for people to read. The probably most potent line in it is where he quotes St. Paul saying, there is neither Jew nor Greek in the church. And the Nazis responded when they found out about the encyclical, they said the following. They said, this is directed exclusively against Germany, both its ideology and its practice, and once again it became a banned material in the German state. What we also know is that around Europe, people were picking up on what the Pope was doing, and so a lot of praise and accolades began coming his way. After his Christmas address in 1941, the New York Times said that the voice of Pius XII is the lonely voice in the silence and darkness enveloping Europe this Christmas. He has left no doubt that the Nazi aims are irreconcilable with his own conception of Christian peace. In 1942, the London Times said that a study of the words which Pius XII has addressed since his ascension leaves no room for doubt. He condemns the worship of force and its concrete manifestations in the suppression of national liberties and the persecution of the Jewish race. And perhaps the strongest vocal statement the Pope ever made was Christmas 1942. He gave his Christmas address and he said the following. He says, "My prayers and concerns go out for the hundreds of thousands who without any fault of their own, sometimes only by reason of nationality or race, are marked down for death by progressive extinction. When people say Pius XII never publicly said anything against the Holocaust, I don't know how they could possibly interpret this phrase any other way, because there was only one people being marked down for progressive extinction in Europe at that time, and everyone knew he was talking about the Jews. In fact, I'm told, I don't speak Italian, but I'm told that the Italian word he used for race is strepe, which I'm told in years past was often the word they used for Jews in Italian. So if that is true, then in fact he did say the Jews by name, but I'm not Italian, so I can't confirm if that's true or not. I'll have to ask some friends. When the Nazis heard this statement over the radio, they were furious. And at the time, the German ambassador to the Vatican was a gentleman named von Ribbentrop, and he said this, he says, "While it's true, the Pope does not refer to National Socialists in Germany by name, his speech is one long attack against everything we stand for. God, he says, regards all people and all races as worthy of the same consideration. Here he is clearly speaking on behalf of the Jews. He is virtually accusing the German people of injustice towards them and makes himself the mouthpiece of the Jewish war criminals." The Nazis knew what he was talking about. Why do so many people say he was silent? It can't possibly be a credible accusation against Pius XII. He did speak out prudently, cautiously, and not very often, but when he did, the words had a lot of meaning. In fact, the Nazis found that message to be so strong that they simply didn't broadcast it to German Catholics that year over the radio. And in Italy, there was a lot of fury. Mussolini was furious with Pius XII for what he did, and he even began to question, have they violated their neutrality? Is the Vatican now open for an attack, an invasion by the Axis powers? But despite that, Pius XII remained at the Vatican, despite many people telling him that he should leave. And one of Mussolini's foreign ministers had to say that he's ready to be deported to a concentration camp rather than go against his conscience. We know now, there's been some recent research, that Hitler was actually planning the kidnapping of Pius XII in 1942-1943. And he commissioned one General Wolf to carry out the plan, in a nutshell, to raid the Vatican, kill the cardinals with his side, and take Pius XII into custody, and if in the aftermath he was killed, well then so be it. It was a very credible plan. Eventually, Hitler's ministers persuaded him not to go through with it, but to quote the great dictator himself, "I want nothing more than to pack up that whole whoring rabble at the Vatican." So much for Hitler's Pope. Short and sweet of it, he wasn't silent. He did speak out, prudently, cautiously, and with a lot of force. But as we know as Christians, actions speak so much louder than words, and that's where Pius XII was the great hero of the Jewish people. In what he did, not so much in what he had to say. Take, for example, Italy. Italy had a Jewish population of about 45,000 Jews. 85% of them were saved from the concentration camps. In September, October 1943, Pius coordinated efforts between priests, sisters, religious, lay, men, and faithful to help Jewish people, either to get them out of the country or hide them in church institutions in Rome and elsewhere. They met in secret because they knew the German ambassador would hear lead of their plans. He also financially helped the Jewish people out. In 1943, it was demanded that the Jews of Rome had to collect 50 kilograms of gold or else they'd all be sent to the camps. They collected 35. The chief rabbi came to Pius asking for the other 15, and he very generously gave it to them. Tragically, many of the Jews in Rome were deported to the concentration camps, and this took place on October 16th, 1943. Prior to this happening, Pius had especially asked the Palatine Fathers since 1938 to coordinate efforts to get either Jews into Rome because it was safe, and once it became unsafe, to get them to other countries. For example, Pius, because he came from a noble family, had a tremendous amount of wealth, personally used a lot of it. Actually, it said on his deathbed he had absolutely nothing left in his bank account, but he spent his own money to buy 3,000 visas to Brazil for any Jewish person who wanted to move to Brazil to be safe. But tragically, 1,259 Jewish people were kidnapped, were captured in the city of Rome, and eventually died in Auschwitz. And by the end of 1944, 2,091 Jewish people would eventually go to the camps. Now, on the day of the roundup, it took place at about 5:30 in the morning when it began. People have always wondered, did Pius know or not? Well, there's nothing credible to say that he had inside information that the roundup was going to take place. What we do know is how he responded once they found out what was happening. Princess Agorna, who was a member of the black nobility, came to the Vatican to tell them what was happening. The Jewish ghetto is actually very close to the Vatican. It's in Trastevere, which is probably only about a mile or two from St. Peter's. What happened was Pius XII asked his cousin, Carlo Pacelli, to go and speak with Bishop Alois Hudel. Bishop Hudel is an interesting character. He was living in Rome, and he was probably the biggest Nazi sympathizer in all of the Vatican. He was actually the one that helped a lot of them get out of Europe and escape war tribunals. He went to Bishop Hudel and told him to write a letter to Cardinal Stahl, who was in charge of the roundup. Bishop Hudel did very obediently, and then he gave it to General Stahl, and General Stahl reported to Himmler, Hitler's number 2 guy. He told Himmler, you need to stop the roundup. Himmler said, we won't stop the roundup. And then eventually he said, well, if you don't, there's going to be an uprising in Rome and the resistance is going to fight back. It was a bluff, and it eventually stopped the deportations from taking place. So while those 1,259 were captured, a lot more were saved by the diplomatic means that the Vatican employed. And in addition, they did save 274 Jewish people because they were mixed. One parent was Catholic, one was Jewish, and so they were exempt from the concentration camps. But where they really became active was after the deportation, the one day, they knew they had to hide the Jews because there was nothing stopping the Gestapo from coming back. And so 155 convents and seminaries and universities and churches were opened up to the Jewish people, including the Vatican and including Castel Gandolfo, which is the Pope's summer residence. The only person who can give permission for anyone to go into Castel Gandolfo is the Pope, and he widely opened the doors to the Jewish people. They think 3,000 Jewish people hid there. And I think the most touching moment I found was that his own bedroom was converted into the obstetrics ward. And they said that 40 Jewish babies were born in the Pope's own bedroom during those days. Another 500 were being hid in the Apostolic Palace. And priests and nuns, they all testified that, well, they opened their doors because the Pope asked them to. And especially for women religious, because they were forbidden from having men be in their convents, the Pope simply dispensed them and said, don't worry about it, allow anyone to come in who needs to. And they were very generous. They would provide kosher food for their guests and allowed them to celebrate synagogue celebrations. What's really tragic, too, about the whole roundup of Rome is, do you know, one of the people who betrayed more Jews was a fellow Jew than herself. She was a woman named Celeste de Porto. She was part of what was called the Black Panther Gang, one of the 2 big gangs in Rome in those days. They called her the Black Pantheress. And she knew the people of the ghetto, so she was constantly luring them out and then betraying them over to the Gestapo. It's sad how so often that happens. You often betray your own. But of the 12,000 Jews who lived in Rome, about 80 to 85% of the community was saved. And that is likely the highest percentage of Jews saved in any city in all of occupied Europe during the Second World War. And we know Pius was behind this. Adolf Eichmann, who was the architect of all the death camps, when he was brought to trial in the 1970s, clearly said they knew Pius XII was behind this. And the great Jewish historian Sir Martin Gilbert, who wrote Churchill's autobiography, he said the Pope himself gave the personal order on the eve of the deportations to open Rome to the sanctuaries within the Vatican for any Jew who could make it, which is profound. You might know Schindler's List. Oskar Schindler was a tremendous man, saved 1,200 Jews. Pius XII saved even more. But his activity wasn't just confined to Rome. He actually had a wide reach in influencing the saving of Jews in other parts of the continent. Take, for example, Italy. Throughout Italy, orders went out from the Pope for them to save Jews. Cardinal Boeto saved 800. The Bishop of Assisi saved 300, both saying that Pius gave them the order. Cardinal Montini, who would become Pope Paul VI, testified that all the work he did to save Jews was, he said very simply, he said, I was just doing my duty, and I accepted my orders from the Holy Father himself. Cardinal Palazzini, who was honored by the state of Israel for saving Jews, says that the merit is entirely Pius XII's. He ordered us to do whatever we could do to save Jews from persecution. Monsignor John Carroll Abing was a priest who was living in the Vatican at the time, a very close friend of Pius. And many of the critics of the Pope have often said, yeah, this wasn't the Pope. This was just priests and nuns out of their own goodwill, taking action. When that was suggested, he said, that is a blatant lie. I spoke to Pius many times during the war, in face, person to person, and he told me not once, but many times to assist the Jews, and I can personally testify that the Pope gave me face-to-face orders to save as many Jews as I could. Or take for the example Hungary. The famous Jewish historian Gino Levi said that in 1944, 2 influential letters came from the Vatican to the nuncio of Hungary telling him to up his efforts to save the Jews of Hungary, so that by the end of 1944, there wasn't a single Catholic institution in Budapest which was not hiding Jews in some capacity. And then when Pius sent in a telegram on June 25th, 1944, he was able to halt the mass exodus of Jews to Auschwitz just before the end of the war. And in one stroke, he saved 170,000 Jews from going to Auschwitz. Likewise in France, because France was occupied for most of the war, there was a very effective underground resistance, and the French Jesuits were very influential behind it. One of them was Henri de Lubac, who would eventually become a cardinal of the church, and he testifies that all of the work he did to fight anti-Semitism in his writings was all inspired by Pius. And one of his fellow Jesuits, Michel Rocco, said that we heard Pius speak and condemn, and so we acted. And throughout those years of terror, we listened to Vatican radio and the Pope's messages, and we felt in communion with him for all the work we were doing to help the Jews and fight Nazi violence. The most famous French priest of them all to help the Jews was Father Pierre-Marie Benoit. He, first of all, helped Jews escape from France to Rome, and they said in the bottom of his abbey, he was just printing out baptism certificate like it was going no tomorrow and giving them out to anyone who wanted one. It's often said that Father Benoit just simply did this out of his own goodness of his heart. I have no doubt that he did. But we know that on July 16th, 1943, he met with Pope Pius XII, and Pius encouraged him and gave him orders, continue the work that you were doing, and he gave him $4 million to continue the efforts. In Slovakia, we know of 6 official protests from the Holy See that were made to stop deportations, so 25% of the Jewish population was saved. Cardinal Palatucci of Campania was one of the bishops who died in the Dachau camps. A lot of priests and bishops were sent to Dachau in Germany and were murdered there. He was sent there because he helped 5,000 Croatian Jews escape to southern Italy, and now recently found documentation has shown that Cardinal did this because he had been given orders by Pius XII. In Denmark, Catholic bishops and priests and laymen and women joined with their Protestant brothers, and they started wearing the Star of David on their clothing to protest how Jews were being treated. And eventually they were able to save almost all 8,000 Jews in the Kingdom of Denmark. And many of them said that it was the inspiration of Pius XII that encouraged them to do so. Cardinal Roncalli would become Pope John XXIII, soon to be Saint John XXIII. We know he did a lot to save Jews in Hungary and Romania, and he helped lots of them escape to Palestine. And in 1957, when they interviewed him about his records, he said, I always referred to the Holy See and afterwards carried out the Pope's orders, save as many human lives as possible. My favorite of all, Pius XII was able to influence the dictator Franco in Spain to give passports to allow Jews to go into Spain. It's unbelievable. Jews coming back into Spain after everything that happened to them. And you can imagine how furious Hitler was when he found out his ally was allowing Jews to come into his country. The long and short of it, the Nazis knew what he was doing, and they had this to say of the Pope: "We should not forget that in the long run, it is the Pope in Rome who is the greater enemy to National Socialism than Churchill or Roosevelt." Now, a question that's often been asked in Pius's relations with the Nazis is, why didn't he excommunicate Hitler? I mean, Hitler is a baptized Catholic. First communion, hopefully reconciliation, confirmation, though I think we can say without any shadow of doubt he long forwent practicing the faith of his fathers. Why didn't he excommunicate him? It was within his power to do so. I think as a Pope, he probably realized that history shows us that any time the papacy decides to excommunicate heads of state, often the repercussions are severe. And very rarely will they attempt to reconcile them for the evil that they have done, but more often than not, increase the persecutions that they've begun. I'll give you two examples. When Pope John the 22nd would have been back in probably the 1200s, he excommunicated Louis IV of Bavaria. And as a thank you for his excommunication, Louis marched into Rome and invaded it and plundered it. When St. Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth in England, he effectively lost the Catholic population in England for hundreds of years to come. Rarely will an excommunication really bring out much good when it goes against the head of a state. And in particular, they were very concerned, what would this do if the Vatican publicly came out and excommunicated Hitler and other members of the Nazi Party? Rabbi Marcus Melchior, during the war, was the chief rabbi of Denmark. And when he was asked, should Hitler have been excommunicated, he said, "It's a complete error to think that Pius XII could have had any influence on the brain of that madman. Had he spoken out in that way, Hitler would have probably massacred far more than 6 million Jews and 10 times 10 million Catholics." This was also the conclusion of the lawyers at the Nuremberg trials, where they brought the Nazi criminals to justice. And as they analyzed different organizations' roles during the Holocaust, Robert Kempner, who was one of the lawyers, had this to say about the Vatican's moves. He said, "Every propaganda move that the Catholic Church had against Hitler's Reich would not have only been provoking suicide, but would have also hastened the execution of still more Jews and priests." And we have the testimony from an Italian priest chaplain, in fact, confronted the Pope on this issue. This is what Pius XII had to say. He said, "I have repeatedly considered excommunicating Nazism in order to castigate them before the civilized word for the bestiality of Judeocide. But after many tears and prayers, I have concluded that a protest would not only fail to help the persecuted, but it might well worsen the lot of the Jews." And history shows us that this is exactly what happened when the church was too vocal in its opposition to the Holocaust. And tragically, Holland is the horrible example of where this took place. In 1942, the Dutch bishops very strongly wrote a pastoral letter that was to be read in every single church in Holland that year. They said they were inspired by the actions of Pius to do so, and we know that they were the most vocal opponents to the Nazis in any Axis-controlled country. But the letter backfired horribly. In retaliation, the Israeli historian Pinchas Lipidi tells us that the saddest and most thought-provoking conclusion is that while the Catholic clergy of Holland protested most loudly, expressly, and frequently against Jewish persecution than any other religious hierarchy in Nazi-occupied countries, more Jews, 110,000 or 79% of its population, were deported to the death camps. And this included all Jewish converts to Catholicism who had previously been exempted from the death camps, and that is why St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein, was one of the ones who died from Holland. When the Nazis read the letter, this is the official response to the Dutch bishops. It said, "Since the Catholic bishops have interfered in our affairs, the entire population of Catholic Jews will now be sent off this week, and no intervention will be considered." And what's tragic, too, is when you consider that there was an acceleration of attack against Jews and Catholic converts from Judaism, but there was one group who were not sent to the camps, and those were Protestant Jews, very specifically because their leaders didn't speak out like the Catholic bishops did, or much more prudent in helping Jews behind the scenes. And in fact, what we find is that throughout Europe, local Jewish leaders were frequently asking religious organizations not to speak out because they worried that things were going to get worse for them. Some examples: Bishop von Galen in Munster, Germany, had made plans to very publicly denounce the Nazis in his own country, but the Jewish leaders came forward and asked him not to because they feared intense persecution would occur. And the testimony of one of the Jews of Rome in 1943 had this to say about the Pope. He said, "None of us wanted the Pope to speak out openly. We are all fugitives, and we do not want to be pointed out as such. The Gestapo would only have increased and intensified its inquisition. It is better that the Pope kept silent. We have all felt the same, and we still believe so today." Or take, for example, the testimony of a bishop in Dachau. He said, "Whenever the Vatican makes protest, life becomes more difficult for us, and the conditions of prisoners are worsened, and we should never forget that 1/5 of all the priests in Poland died in concentration camps." In addition, Pius, it said, also feared that everyone already hidden in Rome would be exposed if such condemnations continued, and he really believed that excommunication would compromise their safety. So instead, in 1942, a secret telegram was sent out to all the bishops of Europe asking them to save as many Jews as possible, but to avoid any more public denunciations, citing that there were also two very major organizations at the time doing the exact same thing. The International Red Cross and the World Council of Churches had also taken the same move to avoid public denunciations and instead focus on helping Jews in secret. When the war was done and the Nuremberg trials began, one thing the Jewish people was not afraid to point the finger at those who were responsible for the Holocaust. And so all across Europe, criminals were being brought to justice. And yet there was one man who was being renownedly praised by Holocaust survivors, and that was Pius XII. I'd like to read you a series of quotes from very prominent Jewish people. The first is Albert Einstein. Einstein said, "The Catholic Church alone stood squarely across the path of Hitler's campaign of suppressing the truth, and I am forced to confess that that which I once despised, I now praise unreservedly." Rabbi Maurice Pelsvig of the World Jewish Congress said, "The repeated interventions of the Holy Father on behalf of the Jewish community in Europe have provoked the profoundest sentiments of appreciation and gratitude from Jews throughout the world." Moshe Sharet, who was the first Prime Minister of the State of Israel, "I am told it is my first duty to thank him, and through him the Catholic Church on behalf of the Jewish public for all they have done in various countries to rescue Jews." Dr. Raffaele Cantoni of the Italian Jewish community, 6 million of my co-religious have been murdered by the Nazis. There would have been even more had it not been for the efficacious intervention of Pius XII. Golda Meir, who also became Prime Minister of Israel. "When fearful martyrdom came upon our people in the decade of Nazi terror, the voice of the Pope was raised for its victims." Rabbi Isaac Hezrog, who became Chief Rabbi of Rome, "The people of Israel will never forget what His Holiness did for our unfortunate brothers and sisters in their most tragic hour of need." Rabbi Eli Tof, who would become a close friend of Pope John Paul II. He, as a young boy, was hiding in Castel Gandolfo. He said, "More than all others, we had the opportunity of experiencing of experiencing the great compassionate goodness and magnanimity of the Pope during those unhappy years of persecution and terror when it seemed that all of us there was no longer an escape. And Rabbi Zoli actually became Catholic after the war, much to the controversy within the Roman community, but he did become Catholic and he took the name Eugenio in honor of the Pope. He said, "The world will blame him for the silence of the world on the face of the Nazi crimes, but the truth is that he ensured that the Vatican would always help the Jews, and we should be forever grateful to him. I know of many priests who have died in concentration camps for following the request of the Pope to save the Jews." And in 1955, the entire Israeli Philharmonic was flown to Rome to perform a concert in honor of the Pope, all expenses paid by the state of Israel. Now, many people suggest that why these Holocaust survivors were being so vocal in praising the Pope was they wanted him to support the state of Israel. So they were trying to puff him up. They were trying to really warm themselves up to the Pope. What we know from Pius was he did support the state of Israel, but he was also very concerned about the Christians living in the country. But in fact, it's very insulting, I think, to say that Holocaust survivors were simply doing it to get the Pope to recognize their state. They were being very genuine because they experienced, many of them firsthand, what the church had done to save them. In 1967, an Israeli historian by the name of Pinchas Lipidi produced probably one of the greatest works on the role of Pius during the war. In his estimation, he believes that about 700,000 or 860,000 Jews were saved by coordinated efforts of the Catholic Church under the reign of Pius XII during the Holocaust. So if all of this is true, and I promise you I've done lots of research to show that it is, why Hitler's Pope? What happened in 1967 to change everything? Maybe some of you remember the play called The Deputy. Out of nowhere, this German playwright produces a play called The Deputy. And in The Deputy is a depiction of Pius XII as a very cruel, indifferent, hardened anti-Semite who allowed Hitler to run with the Holocaust, who did very, very little to protest, very little to help the people. And the church very vocally protested the play, but unbelievably popular, riding on some anti-Catholic sentiment in the 1960s. And it was strange, almost overnight, once the play became popular, all of a sudden new histories were beginning to pop up. Revisions, disregarding the testimonies of Holocaust survivors and other first-hand witnesses, to really say, well, maybe Pius didn't do anything. Maybe the church was very anti-Semitic. Maybe they didn't care. And it really seems that from there, all of a sudden, a whole new wave of books, especially in the 1990s, were beginning to be produced, claiming that the church was very anti-Semitic and that Pope Pius XII in particular did nothing to help the Jewish people. On a personal note, I've always found that accusation against Pius as being cold and indifferent. People really don't understand who he was. When Rome was bombed in 1943, the San Lorenzo district is where a lot of the industrial stuff is. When Pius found out that it was bombed, he personally went there. He got out of the car and began blessing bodies, offering last rites, gave personal money, and they said that his cassock was so covered in blood and guts and dirt that he had to go and get a new one. There's this amazing picture of him with his arms extended out in the form of a cross speaking to the people of Rome. This was not a cold man. This was a man who, before John Paul and Benedict and Francis made kissing babies and shaking people's hands popular, he would do this too. He was a very holy man. And when the Deputy came out, the Hungarian Jewish historian Gino Levi was furious, and so he produced his own book called Hungarian Jewry and the Papacy. Pius did not remain silent, and he showed very explicitly all that the Pope had done. And then it's been really edifying. And it's probably the last 10, 15 years, there's been some excellent books produced defending the role of Pius during that time. But if I may step back for a moment, I think one of the things that often happens within our own church, where this negative image of Pius XII comes up, is for whatever reason, there are Catholic brothers and sisters who really like pitting Pope against Pope. right? They've been doing it with Francis and Benedict a whole lot. But the other reason they do it is people love to compare Pius XII and John the 23rd. And I think they like to categorize them as Pius was old and rigid and conservative and stuffy and was keeping the church in the Middle Ages. And John the 23rd was loving and gine and gentle and open-minded and was going to make everything better. And it's so ridiculous. They don't appreciate that the work of Pius XII is what allowed the Second Vatican Council to happen. He was the Pope that revolutionized biblical study. He was the Pope that first gave even permission to begin to speak of evolution within the context of the Genesis story. He was the one that was already beginning to reform the liturgy, changed Holy Week, how it would be celebrated. He really set the seeds for everything to happen at Vatican II, and then the genius of John the 23rd to take it and allow the Great Council to take place. Please don't believe this myth that Pius XII was keeping everything back and John the 23rd was going to make everything right. It's ridiculous. It was the work of these two popes that allowed the church to be where it is today. And as a side note, I think it is kind of comical that in 1962, John the 23rd wrote an entire constitution on why we should keep Latin in the Mass. But we didn't listen to him. But I do think it's kind of funny that he wrote that just before the council. Anywho, my digression. What I'm trying to get at is that I think what so often happens in our church is sometimes we pit each other against each other, and we can't fall into that mindset. We shouldn't pit popes against each other. We've been blessed in this last 150 years. They've been very saintly men, and so we should honor them as such. Where I think the whole Pius XII World War II Holocaust debate stands right now is at a very exciting threshold. There is a gentleman by the name of Gary Krupp, who's a Jewish historian, and he set up something called Pave the Way Foundation. I should say Pave the Way Organization. And what he's doing is he's collecting first-hand testimonies from all over the world to clear Pius's name. And to date, he's collected 10,000 plus documents. If you'd like them, you can actually write to him, and he'll open them up to you. I wrote to him, and I can look at them if I really want. I haven't been able to, but he's doing a lot of great work to give us first-hand concrete evidence of personal testimonies of people who were saved by the church in Pius XII. Another interesting revelation that's come out only the last few years revolves around the play The Deputy. And they're beginning to think that the German playwright didn't actually write it. There's great suspicion that it was actually the Soviet Union and the KGB who produced it, which is not totally inconceivable, because when you look at the Soviet Union, they very much hated Pius XII because he was just as vocal against communism as he was against fascism. And they knew if they wanted to control anything in the Soviet Empire, they needed to crush the Catholic Church. And there was a very big Catholic Church in Russia, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, which they were having a hard time stomping out. So what better way than to destroy the morale of the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Czechs, anyone else living under the Iron Curtain, than to defame the late great Pope who was held up as a savior of the Jewish people. Very effective, and then the play was leaked out to the rest of the modern world. What's probably going to be the biggest revelation is when they finally open up the archives in the Vatican. They always have a 75-year holding period over specific archives. So if you add up the math, they shouldn't quite yet open up 1939 to 45, but both, I believe Benedict XVI said just get on with it and open up those archives as soon as they can. So I don't know where it stands right now, but soon the Vatican archives will be open to any scholar to look through all the documentations in the Vatican about what they were doing in this period. I personally think they're not going to find anything other than what we already know. The Pope did tremendous work to save the Jews. On a personal note to end, one of the most moving moments of my life was praying in front of Pius XII's tomb. It's amazing. It's right below St. Peter's, the main basilica. Right below the main basilica is something called the Clementine Chapel. And if you look, there's a little hole, and you can see the bones of St. Peter. I got to say Mass on it. It was so great. But opposite the Clementine Chapel is where Pius XII is buried, because he was the one that, during the war, were all the excavations to try to find Peter's bones. And so in honor of that, they buried him. And it's so simple, his tomb. There's no gold, no diamonds, nothing fancy. It's just a simple stone tomb. and it's a powerful place. And I remember just sitting there and praying, and it was really deep on my heart to try to defend this man's good name. And I really do hope they canonize him. Not really because he saved Jews, which is amazing, but because he was a genuinely holy man. And that's what a saint is, somebody who was not perfect, but was truly holy for others to see. So that's my hope, that's my prayer, and we'll see what happens from there.